Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can, of course, follow us through email blast. You can also follow us on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, a whole bunch of other podcatchers. And you can hear me replayed on Friday nights on a host of other networks, including People's Internet Radio, PSN, AwakeRadio.us, a whole bunch of other places. So lots of ways to listen. I don't want to drone on too long because I'm very excited about today's show and our guest. We are going to be speaking with Dr. Isa Blumi, who is a senior lecturer and associate professor at Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies. Isa is the author of several books, the latest of which is Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World, and we will be discussing Isa's book and a whole lot more on today's episode. Isa Blumi, how are you? It's good to finally be talking with you.
I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your audience.
Excellent. I'll just, and one quick note, Isa and I are pre-recording this, and the situation in Yemen is obviously, very fluid. It changes a lot. So, there might be some stuff that, when you're listening to this, it might be a little bit out of date. I will, of course, update anything like that in the show notes for today's episode. But I just wanted to sort of throw that out there. And Isa, I actually heard you on the podcast Around the Empire, which I highly suggest people go and check out. And, I was listening to it because I've always been fascinated with Yemen and the situation there. We were talking through some emails the last couple of weeks. I've always had a strong affinity for Yemen, and I've talked about it many times on the show before. And usually when I would discuss it, and the way I would analyze the kind of current situation and the historical ramifications for why it is the way it is right now, I kind of realized that I was maybe a little bit off myself, and I'm not an expert, but I've always prided myself on, understanding Yemen maybe better than the average person, especially like the U.S. public. But listening to your conversation on Around the Empire, checking out your book, which we will link up to in the show notes if people want to get a copy of it, I've seen that there's a lot more to the current situation in Yemen, and certainly the historical events that have led up to this. And I've usually kind of gone with the analysis that this is really sort of a fight, like an age-old imperial fight between regional and world powers that have sort of used Yemen as like a battleground for them to, I guess, fight one another. And I think there's some truth to that, but your recent book kind of fleshes this narrative out a lot more. And we begin to see that there is also quite a bit having to do with resources, which is something that I think a lot of people kind of miss when they're discussing Yemen or when they're talking about Yemen. So why don't we just kind of dive right into it? And let's sort of start, I guess, with the where your book kind of starts in the mid 1800s, where Yemen was, seen as this new place for the colonialist, imperialist powers at the time to kind of get their, meat hooks into. And a lot of this had to do with resources. And let's kind of start with the British East India Company, which I didn't even realize, had viewed Yemen as this a new place for them to get involved in. So I'll just kind of throw it to you, Isa, and have you kind of flesh out the historical narrative about Yemen.
Yes, well, thank you. And again, this opportunity to share with your audience, and given the opportunity to actually use a little bit more than 5 minutes to explain what actually how we can account for this horrible violence directed at Yemen, is crucial. And I am very much grateful for this chance, because one cannot account for why Yemen is forced to have to confront a whole slew of often very conflicted interests, and do it basically in this kind of black hole of media coverage, which in itself should alert your audience to realize that there's actually something very big at stake here. If indeed even those adventurous journalists who do make their way to this region, they're reporting in a very particular way that continues to disguise not only the humanitarian disaster that is facing Yemen today and is likely to face Yemen for the next couple of years at least, but also, and more importantly, the reasons why there is a war in Yemen. The usual resorting to Orientalists like cliches, tribal society, medieval backward peoples, more recent use of Islam, the equation of Islam being the kind of natural hostile faith to the modern world, and this is a part of the world that needs to be integrated into civilization as far as not only social, culturally, but again, just underneath the surface, the suggestion it needs to be integrated economically as well is rarely visited upon. And this should alert all of us to suspect there's actually something much to do about what I will now for the next 20, 30 minutes highlight, that Yemen has long been on the radar screens of many and interested parties. In many ways, Yemenis were net exporters of global phenomena, global processes. Yemen had long been a hub for intellectual development. People have migrated to Yemen even before the rise of Islam. It was a major center of Jewish studies. Maybe some of your audience have heard the name Sheba, Queen Sheba, and its important relationship with Persia and the relationship with the Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia. So this is a region that in the immediate area has long been, in many ways, the epicenter of external elements wishing to tap into the known wealth of this remarkable part of the Arabian Peninsula, in large part because it sits in the middle of these seasonal waves of monsoon rains that make this country very lush and very rich in agriculture and very rich in water resources. And the very strategic location between the Indian Ocean, East Africa, and the Red Sea makes it also a crucial trading hub that accounts for why it was a place of pilgrimage for over 1,500 years amongst the world's Muslims. And it's only in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, when finally the British East India Company, step back a little bit. The Dutch, I was reminded giving a talk 2 days ago in Amsterdam, that the Dutch actually briefly had a commercial interest in the 18th century when the port of Muha became a major point of communication between the larger world and Yemen because of its main cash crop of the time, coffee. Coffee became a very much big part of the consumer economy of Europe, with the Dutch introducing this cash crop in its finished product. Indeed, coffee became more or less an addiction to larger world around this time. So at this time already, Yemen is integrated into the global economy via this, one of the first capitalist enterprises we know in history, the Dutch East India Company. And so the British, following suit with pool of investors in this, basically a company traded in the stock market named the British East India Company, with some assets in India, begin to realize that connecting with the larger East African Arabian Peninsula matrix makes not only sense, but strategically it's crucial in order to protect the shipping lanes that are going circumventing Africa at the time to reach India and Southeast Asia. And they're also tapping into the fact that, especially from southern Yemen, the area that would be an independent country from 1967 until 1990, and in many ways will likely be an independent country, or at least a broken up polity in the near future, had long connections with the same areas that the Dutch and the British and later on the French were investing in trying to control the trade, especially to China. And what we would call in the literature the Hadrami phenomenon. So the Hadramaut is the region that connects the hinterland with the Indian Ocean. And it's a place of pilgrimage, again, for over 1,500 years. Muslims from around the world, scholars would come to train with some of the greatest scholars of their era, located in what today looks like a desert town, but in those days, and you can look up pictures of Shibam and Tarim, they were called the Manhattan of Arabia. These quite remarkable skyscrapers of 8 to 10 stories made of brick and mud, quite spectacularly located, and again, a hub of intellectual exchange and a hub for regional commodities exchanges. And because of this relationship with the Indian Ocean, many of these thinkers spread their wings wide and far. So in many ways, Islam spreads at the very beginning of the modern era of Islamic history on the backs of these trading families from Yemen. So within the first 3 or 4 generations of Islam, in which the first Quran is most likely composed in Yemeni areas that consist of Yemen today, indeed, you find the oldest exemplars of Quran in Yemen, and you see these magnificent manuscript libraries that are now being systematically destroyed by incendiary bombs by Saudi American planes, are an indication that Yemen is a globally integrated, intellectually, culturally, as spiritually, and more importantly for the British, commercially. And so what the British in the beginning of the 19th century are recognizing is that they're confronting in India, in Southeast Asia, as the Dutch are and the French are, they're confronting people who actually have claim their family origins and maintain links to Yemen. So all these Muslim polities in Sumatra, in Malaysia, in Borneo, in Java, in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, they all have heritage back to Yemen. So it behooved all these commercial enterprises, who are often on an equal footing in many ways, and were just negotiating the right of access to these markets controlled by these Muslim polities, are now getting it into their strategic thinking, because these are, of course, capitalists who are also monopolists. They're not interested in sharing wealth. They're not interested in cooperating and dividing up the spoils of and the fruits of global trade. They want to control it. They want to dominate markets. And here they start to take a strategic decision to actually align themselves and create political entities throughout the coast of southern Arabia, what they would call themselves sultanates, and basically recognize local rulers in different places and actually pit one against the other, a kind of divide and control plan that was used effectively in India already and used effectively in other parts of the Americas, if you recall, if your audience will recall. So by 1838-39, the British East India Company lands in Aden and negotiates a treaty with a local ruler, and basically makes the point that you can use our shipping lanes, you can use our access to Indian markets. It's a very lucrative market, but you're going to have to guarantee that you work with us exclusively. So what the British slowly begin to do in the late 1830s is to try to lay exclusive claim to at least the strategic trading points in the West Indian Ocean world and its connections to the larger East. It's around this time that they begin to invest in the similar kinds of political economic alliances in the Gulf. So in Bahrain, in Ras Al Khaimah, which was the big state in what today is UAE. And what's important in this larger context is that the Ottoman Empire, with and through its subject in Egypt, Muhammad Ali, this Albanian soldier who had thrown the French out in the beginning of the 19th century, has also expanded into Yemen at precisely the same time. So you begin to see the Ottoman Empire and the British capitalist enterprises that are part of this coalition called the British East India Company beginning to face off against each other for the first time. And it plays itself out and similarly in areas that we would call today Kuwait or southern Iraq. So this is important. This is really the only beginning. The beginning of the 19th century is really the only time where the Europeans come into play as serious potential game changers for the politics of southern Arabia. And unfortunately, this is the way that we need to start understanding the events of today, because the same kind of strategies would be applied throughout the next 200 years. It would manifest in different ways. It would actually translate in different kinds of strategies of consolidating authority and influence over Arabian Peninsula's politics and certainly its economic wealth. And we'll know more of that in say, middle of the 1920s, and I'll get back to that in a second. But I just want to quickly take us through the rest of the 19th century, because it really will help us then appreciate how the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire and frontiers of what would be called kind of a loose set of alliances between the British and these local sultanates in South Yemen would be formed. So the moment that the British and then later on French and Italian companies and others are making these incremental investments in local alliances, whether it be in Eritrea or what today is Zanzibar or Oman or in Kenya or Somalia, and the Ottomans are expanding from the north going southwards, the strategic value of the Red Sea itself becomes apparent. They begin to see a recognition that controlling the Horn of Africa and controlling the southwestern part of Arabia across the Bab al-Mandab, kind of entry point to the Red Sea, becomes of great strategic importance to all the potential monopolists of the world. And so this is when they start to envision actually connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea vis-a-vis a canal. The technology is now available. There's now the kinds of shipping capacities. There's the steamship that would likely expedite the transport of goods and services between India and Asia and Europe via a canal that makes suddenly the strategic value of the Red Sea exponentially expand. And here you really begin to see the makings of what ultimately becomes Yemen as number one target for capitalist imperialism of the second half of the 19th century onwards. And so the story is too convoluted, and one needs to refer to a number of texts. You're always welcome to look at one of my books on the late Ottoman Empire to appreciate how I at least frame the intersections between global finance capitalism, the construction of this infrastructure, whether they be ports along the coast of Yemen or the Suez Canal itself, leads to this ultimate ambition of occupying all of Arabian Peninsula in one shape or form. And so by the end of World War I, the British have proven themselves to have more or less been saddled with the costs of maintaining a vast territorial empire without the means to actually exert violence to secure authority over these spaces. There has been an incremental kind of standardization of international law, the standardization of practices in trade, which has certainly helped Atlantic European powers to become quasi-hegemonic in large sections of the world. And with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, in many ways, a coalition of capitalist forces that have been bullying the empire, very much like other present-day independent countries in Africa have been bullied through austerity, through debt financing, through incremental uses of violence, insurgencies. By the end of 1918, the Ottoman Empire has been more or less erased from the Arabian Peninsula. What has followed, however, is not necessarily a political order that would reflect the Middle East at large. Recall by 1920, the British and the French had, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, divided up the Middle East amongst themselves. That was not the case in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula was up for grabs. It was up for grabs because many of the indigenous actors themselves were still very much autonomous, if not politically, certainly economically. You had these very wealthy, successful, astute commercial families that had bought patronage or through patronage had secured political influence on both sides of the Red Sea, throughout the Indian Ocean. And so the British and the French and the Italians and the others who are flirting with this process of monopolizing trade in the Indian Ocean had to deal with significant adversaries. And the last thing they were eager to do was actually confront them militarily. They could not, in fact, do that. And so it would be this continuation of partnerships, availing their global resources to help local signatory allies survive the politics of Arabia, and in some cases, like the Al Saud family, with British weapons, with British diplomatic support, and this phenomena of what we would call today Takfiri Islam or Wahhabism begin to make the move towards, at least in large segments of Central and Eastern Arabia, a hegemonic move. And by 1925, Mecca and Medina is conquered by the Saudi-British alliance. Much of Central Arabia is conquered. Much of the coast of the east is conquered by the Saudi-British alliance. And they're moving very dramatically and quickly, not to the Gulf, which, again, they don't know there's oil there. They know there's oil in the areas around Basra and on the other side of in the Iranian territories of the Gulf. But they have no idea there are resources elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula. What they're aiming for is the securing Southwest Arabia, in other words, Yemen. And so they move incrementally, conquering Mecca, Medina. They allow Wahhabism and they make the claim that it's some kind of standardization, a kind of international modernization of the practice of Islam, very much akin to a centralized church. This is something the British, French, and others were actually eager to instill or install in the Islamic world, to have some kind of reliable partner who could harness and lay claim at least to authority over global Islam. The Saudis have certainly attempted that since then. Whether or not it's recognized as such is debatable and depends on what part of the Islamic world we're talking. Certainly in Yemen, they do not accept at all the decrees coming from Riyadh, Mecca. And so this is the context for a conflict that is regional, is local. It is between Saudis and various polities in Yemen, but it also has this larger global imperialist context. And again, it is important to highlight that the British had instrumentalized Islam through its alliance with the Saud family and Wahhabism. And this would continue to be a ploy and a tool of empire until today. The kind of very stark different kinds of references and uses of Islam, the rhetoric of Islam, what today we are encouraged to think in terms of a universally hostile, anti-Western, anti-intellectual kind of violent conflict between the West and the East is a byproduct of this exploitation of Islam as a tool for the Saud and British project in the 30s and 40s. And I'm saying this because Yemen, again, will be at the forefront of this clash within the Islamic world itself, or maybe even more accurately, Islamic worlds, and the alliance between the Saudis first the British and then ultimately the Americans, who would take over the use of Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism, political Islam in the 1940s onwards. Yemen, again, plays an important part of this. The political logic, or the logic of hegemony, the logic of capitalist monopoly of the Arabian Peninsula required that Yemen be subdued. Yemen remained resilient, remained resistant. There would be, in the areas that would ultimately be identified as northern Yemen, the areas that are primarily under siege today in this horrible, horrible war, had by the end of the Ottoman Empire, meaning 1918, consolidated politically around a ruling family that had in many ways ruled over this part of Arabia for over 1,000 years. And we're going to use the term imamate, or in reference to the imam, or kind of political and religious leader of this now large territory called North Yemen. And from this point after World War I until 1962, when they were finally overthrown by Egyptian forces in a coup in 1962, this ruling family and North Yemen as a whole was a big thorn in the larger enterprise of expanding capitalist imperialism in this part of the world. And so I'm not sure if you want to intervene at this stage to ask a question, or if you allow me to continue with this narrative that may sound a bit complicated, but I assure your audience it isn't necessary to make the larger claims about what's going to happen to Yemen in the next 60 years.
I think great. Isa, do you have headphones on your end? I'm getting a little bit of an echo from my every time I'm talking. So if you have headphones, throw those in, just because I think it's coming through your computer. But no, this is excellent stuff. And again, I hope the listeners appreciate what you're saying here. I mean, the complexity of all of this is so missed in the general Western narrative about Yemen. I would say even in the Arab world, this narrative is always kind of simplified, and I think we'll get to that a bit later when we get to the 90s and early 2000s, and certainly the conflict that we're seeing right now has been simplified vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and the UAE's involvement in destroying Yemen at the moment. But I think we'll just sort of let you continue there. I just wanted to throw in one thing. You're talking about the spread of Wahhabism. And I just wanted to point out, I know you talk about this in your book, but I mean the type of Islam that's practiced in Yemen is varied by region, and it is a very different form of Islam than we certainly see in Saudi Arabia and other places. I mean, there's the Zaidi faith, which is what the Ansar Allah or the Houthis practice, which is quite different. The distinctions, we hear so much about Sunni and Shia, and we have these illusions like we understand what they are, and a lot of those sorts of molds are broken when it comes to Yemen. So just again to add on the complexity of all this. But Isa, I would just I'd love to hear you just kind of continue this historical narrative that you've got going right now, because there's so much here. So I'll just throw it back to you.
Very good. So I'm hoping that these earphones are better, but now that I can continue on, we're now in the 1920s, 1930s. And I would probably suggest that we put up a map at some point, and I can even suggest certain kinds of maps, but your audience really needs to be following along with a map, if it's possible, unless they're experts of this area, because I'm going to be referring to regions that no longer actually are discussed in these terms, but were actually central to the strategic calculations of various players in this period. And this is the interwar period, right? So this includes Mussolini, who had invested heavily in reaffirming Italian, let's say, superiority. So they're very actively involved in Eritrea, what today is Eritrea. You have the Soviet Union, which, ironically enough, one of the first places the Bolsheviks form a political, or are able to acquire political recognition, was with the imamate of North Yemen. Supposedly this medieval backward Islamic state is actually very tuned into the global dynamics that are taking place in the 1920s and 30s. And of course, the French with Djibouti, the British with Somalia, the Italians have another little part of interest in the Horn of Africa in Somalia, in southern Somalia. So there's all kinds of global dynamics at play after World War I, that implicates North Yemen and in direct conflict with what was, again, this enterprise in investing in the Saud family. Investing in Islam is a way to subdue, the way I like to frame it is use Islam against Muslims, right? Because throughout the world, Islamic world, Muslims were very defiant, very rebellious against colonialism. They were rebellious against the inherent materialism of the capitalist kind of global economy that was emerging. They had functioning sets of legal principles that did not cave to the pressures of global capital. Each region was ruled or, let's say, adjudicated by very articulate and economically practicing judges. And Yemen, in fact, you mentioned the so-called divide between Zaydi and Shafi. This is a school of Sunni jurisprudence. In fact, scholars from around the world would gravitate to come and study, regardless if North Yemen was under a Zaydi ruler, which they were for over 1,000 years. The Gulf of, this other place of intellectual learning and pilgrimage, Tarim, which is in Hadramaut, was also, if you actually look at the legal documentation and the legal their way of actually interpreting Islamic law, it would in no means, in our language today, help us understand why people from around the Islamic world would gravitate there. They would treat them as somehow marginal today. But in fact, this was what was attractive for the rest of the world, to come and train under scholars who would teach them all the interpretations of various interpretations over the last 1,000 years. When you were to study as a judge, to become a judge or an interpreter of the law in Indonesia or in Egypt or in Mauritania, you would come to these places to learn what others interpreted, how they interpreted and adjudicated the law. Now, what the British are trying to do with the Wahhabism, with the kind of physical occupation of the kind of symbolically most important hubs of the Islamic world, Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina, this drive to go into northern Yemen was to actually try to control once and for all the way Muslims understood and interpreted the world through Islamic law. If they could actually try to and successfully create a universally applied, singularly kind of referential and deferential legal system, they would have accomplished what they did with elsewhere, which is what we would call today international trade law, for instance. And those of you who are familiar with the law and understand Western law and how it's practiced in the larger world today, you have to appreciate that this is really a 19th to 20th century phenomenon where globally we are all practicing a kind of a regular or normative code. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Isra Hussein, who recently published the book and the study of how the British imposed on Malaysia, India, and Egypt a uniformly and universally applied notion of Islamic law. And so Yemen constituted one of those last havens in the larger Islamic world where they were producing judges and writing critiques of how Islamic law was being practiced now in British or French-controlled Islamic territories, which was basically the entire Islamic world at this time, right? All of Africa was now under the hands of two empires, under all the Middle East. Turkey, by this time, had more or less abandoned its relationship to Islam, with Ataturk secularizing that country. So you really have only the last remaining hub of independent Islam, if you will, practiced in its old traditions of 1,500 years of ecumenical spirit of learning from each other, of giving autonomy to each judge to adjudicate depending on the conditions. My goodness, there's a drive-by shooting there.
Yeah,
Okay.
that happens every single episode. So you know.
Yeah. So that gives the audience a sense of what happens in Yemen all the time. It's you're faced with motorcycles zooming by you every second. Yeah. So, anyways, the point is that actually, if you think of it in strategic terms, and if you actually think about the British trying to harness Islam to use against Muslim resistance to global capitalism in its modern form, you begin to appreciate why Yemen was so important. And so by the time Mecca, Medina is captured by the Sauds, and they have then desecrated the Prophet's family's grave sites and burnt down much of the libraries, and were basically creating a modern Islam to suit what I would suggest is global imperialism. They start to territorially move further south if you can follow from Mecca, Medina, Jeddah southwards along the coast of the Red Sea, they're incrementally entering into territories that are ruled by a dynasty that had been there for 200 years, named the Idrisi. And so by 1934, the Idrisi have been more or less phased out of the politics of Arabia, just like the Hashemites were phased or brutally removed from the Hijaz, where Mecca, Medina is. It's not by mistake that one of the sons of the major Arab allies of the British during World War I would then be invited to rule as king in Iraq, of all places, right? But definitely not Mecca, Medina, where he's actually from. So Faisal becomes this disgruntled kind of marginal player in Iraq, helping the British basically concoct this fiction called Iraq. And his younger brother, Abdullah, was encouraged to help subdue Palestine by allowing him to become this self-declared king of Transjordan, which would eventually be Jordan. And so this is how they got rid of the Hashemites from the Hijaz, the family that had ruled over Mecca, Medina, or helped administer for 1,000 years. The Rashidi, who ruled much of Central Arabia for hundreds of years, were also violently removed by the Saudi Wahhabi British alliance. One of the prominent descendants of this family, Madawa Rashidi, she's one of the most important voices, scholars working on contemporary Saudi politics. She's in the LSE in London. I recommend looking at some of her stuff, because she also has this important insights into the nature of this alliance between the British Americans and Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism. So finally, in 1934, this Saudi-British alliance entered into what is still considered the heart of North Yemen's cultural, economic hub, if you will. And it's an area that has been occupied since 1934 by the Saudi state, and we call it the Asir, A-S-I-R, Asir. And its main town, Abha, it's been divided by it's territorially a little bit by the Saudis since then. But this would more or less constitute the undeclared border between what remained North Yemen, the Imamate, and Saudi borders. And this is the main area of conflict today. This is where all the nasty fighting in the mountains, this is where all the American special forces are, this is where the Israeli special forces are. This is the kind of big contested area. And this is the origins of Ansar Allah, or the so-called Houthis, what some people will insist are the main protagonists or adversaries in this war against Saudi American hegemony. It's the same group crudely referred to as being Iran's pawn in this war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a completely false narrative. And I'll get to later on to explain why this is just utter nonsense, but useful way of justifying this war, of course.
Yes.
So by 1934, Saudi Arabia had secured this area, Asr, north of what today is northern Yemen, and that would become a point of contention ever since. Now, the way that the British were able to facilitate a so-called loose treaty over this undeclared bounded area between Saudi Arabia and the Imam of Yemen was to allow the people living on both sides to traverse the so-called unmarked border whenever they wanted. Because people they didn't recognize the border, they continued to live more or less economically, politically, culturally for the next 50 years or so. And again, this will be important as I refer back to this region later. So please, the audience, keep this in mind. In the meantime, the British had consolidated their influence over the domestic politics of these various different sultanates in southern Yemen to the point where they were actually able to consolidate a boundary. They had in 1915-16, they had actually agreed upon a boundary with the Ottoman Empire, and the local rulers would recognize this. And as the Imamate of North Yemen starts to consolidate, and after losing this war with the Saud British in the north, begin to focus again on how to protect Yemen from further encroachments. Because it was quite clear that the British, Saudis, Wahhabis were hell-bent on capturing these key areas of what remained independent Islamic world. And so what progressed from then was that the Imamates spent considerable amounts of political capital assuring that it could balance off larger regional rivalries between the Italians, the British, the French, and then, as I said, the Soviets got involved a little bit in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And this would continue on for the next 20, 30 years. What's so interesting about Imam Yahya, who was again treated in the literature since 1962 at least, and certainly throughout Western media as this backward medieval, self-isolating ruler, very cruel, he had slaves, and all these kind of really derogatory kind of references, is that he was able to not only maintain an autonomous independence and even sometimes territorially expanding so-called medieval state, but because of the global connections that diplomatically and commercially he was able to secure, he was able to stem off at various times these encroachments from the British and then the Americans later on. So he was basically using kind of balancing the early interwar period Cold War between the various competing European powers in the Red Sea. And again, this is important for us to appreciate because as North Yemen demonstrates, it's impervious to overtures from Europeans, especially the British. And then the Americans will come in at some point in an interesting way. And if you have a chance to read my book, I'll actually provide this very interesting narrative about the oil guy who comes and starts to sniff around North Yemen in the 19th. That's correct, 1930s. He's a very interesting character. So again, briefly, the Imam Yahya is very cognizant of this expansionist British project. It's coming from the south via these sultanates in South Yemen, and it's coming from the Sauds, who are more or less functioning the same way in the north, and more dangerously for the entire North Yemen. And I think this is one of the reasons why he's able to keep politically in order sets of alliances that would allow him and allow Yemen to remain independent for so long, is that even those who would be deemed conservative Sunni Muslims recognize that their traditions would be threatened by the expansion of Wahhabism. So even if they had these seemingly Shia-Sunni conflicts, which they did not, Yemenis do not see themselves in any different way. Even Zaidi jurisprudence is much closer to Shafi Sunni Islamic jurisprudence traditions than anything that the Twelver Shia have up in Iran. And indeed, there was actually some very deep hostilities between Zaydis and Twelver Shia, who emerged much later in Islamic history. So by the 1930s, with this unfortunate moment in which parts of northern Yemen is occupied by the Saudi state, incomes, because again, North Yemen is highly prized. It's a very, agriculturally, it's producing remarkable surpluses at times. And it produces a variety of cash crops that are highly valued in the larger world, including coffee, of course. So at this time, we have this Twitchell guy come in, and he's part of these kind of trade delegations that are coming from Aden, which is the southern port under British coalition, say, administration. And these Americans are coming up into northern Yemen, into the highlands of northern Yemen, through Taiz, which is the capital at this time, and trying to encourage the imam to open up the economy, not open up the economy to the world, because it's already open up to the world economy, but more open up to us, the Americans.
And Standard Oil, right?
Well, he's not sharing this information with the imam, but he is indeed a geologist. He has actually been sent by Standard Oil. This is before Aramco. This is before Saudi Arabia. The Americans don't have access to Saudi Arabia, right? It's the British sphere of influence. The Americans are trying to get a foot into the door into the Middle East, which is monopolized by the British and French at this time. And so they were thinking North Yemen would be the way in. So here's this Twitchell guy moving around. I mean, he's hosted very generously by the imam's guys. He's allowed to go and conduct his geological surveys as he's lying to them through his teeth. But at some point, it becomes quite clear that he's up to no good, and the imam throws him out. He says, "I'm not going to allow you to sniff around, and you're asking for too much. You want to go up into this valley where no one lives? Why are you going up in this valley? Why are you interested up there? Just, get out. We don't trust you." And it's this Twitchell who then moves to Saudi Arabia. And it's this Twitchell who basically turns the Saud family away from the British and becomes the kind of principal interlocutor between American capitalists, American power, including Standard Oil and these other guys, and the Saud family. He ostensibly creates Aramco.
Right.
So Aramco's story, the big story of American oil. Read Robert Vitalis's America's Kingdom. It's an amazing book, the whole history of Aramco and the importation of American race politics into Saudi Arabia, into these compounds where oil workers are being recruited from all over the world. It's an amazing story, but it's a Yemeni story. It starts in Yemen because Twitchell is thrown out by the imam. The imam is so principled. This is important for your audience. The Yemenis are so principled that you can't buy them. There's something more valuable than just taking a box full of gold and just allowing these Americans or Brits to run havoc in your land. And this is something that has been written out of history after this family is thrown out of power, and it's by design. We are not encouraged to think about the period before the establishment of the North Yemen Republic in 1962 as anything sophisticated enough to see it in terms of resisting the expansion of global capitalism. So it's a remarkable moment. And the fact that they're still willing to do business with the Italians, with the Soviets, with various polities throughout the Indian Ocean world means that they're not hostile to trade. They're not stupid. And there's nothing in Islamic history that would suggest otherwise. I mean, it's perfectly acceptable to make money, but you have to make money in a just way. You have to distribute the resources in a just way. And most importantly, you cannot be monopolistic. You can't kind of overlook things like your faith in God or whatever it is that becomes the animating factor in a polity. And the Saudis have demonstrated the complete opposite. They're willing to sell their faith, they're willing to sell their religion, and to sell the natural resources to these heathens, right? These capitalist, monopolistic, beer drinking kind of Anglo-Saxons. I mean, and the Imam is writing throughout all this time this very, very serious critiques of what he's observing in the area, in the world around him. And it's quite telling how in some quarters of resistance is this constant reference of lack of standards. There's a direct conflict from what we believe to how people are practicing their day-to-day existence. And we're going to, on principle, remain, dutifully good Muslims and be fair as much as we can to our people. And this basically becomes this kind of, again, sore, last remaining area of resistance in an otherwise almost entirely dominated Islamic world. And for me, I think that's the most important way to understand and appreciate North Yemen moving forward. And so World War II, the Americans have become the ascendant power in Saudi Arabia. The British are basically a marginal player at best. They're doing their best to try to keep empire east of Suez on the cheap. They're basically given more or less de facto independence to all these sultanates in South Yemen. There's this vast territory called the Empty Quarter, which is not marked by any boundaries. The British were never interested in coming into a kind of agreement with North Yemen in that regard. And they certainly were not going to allow the Saudis to start dictating where Saudi Arabia begins and ends up in this Empty Quarter, because by this time, now we're talking about the 1940s, 1950s, the geologists have already come to the conclusion that southern Yemen is the big prize. It is the place where you're going to keep for a rainy day huge oil, and eventually they'll begin to realize that you can exploit gas as well, gas resources. And this will be important moving forward. The tragic, as it's always the case, the tragic irony, the richest countries in the world will end up being the poorest, especially because the political leadership are resilient and autonomous and resist for a number of different reasons. But for the imamates, they, at least rhetorically, they're resisting on basis of principle. And now I need to highlight this because this is a very interesting part of my research that I found largely in the American archives, because they're shaking their head, they're scratching their head by the 1940s. How could we corrupt these people? We've been so successful in corrupting the Sauds, and we've been successful in corrupting other places of the world. If we don't corrupt them directly, then we just send in the Marines, right? Whether it be, especially in Latin America or the Philippines, right? They have this working model to become the hegemonic global power, but it's just not working in North Yemen. So it's the beginning of the whole period of post Bretton Woods. The American dollar has become the kind of de facto currency of exchange, gives enormous leverage to the Americans, to the Central Bank of the United States, gives enormous leverage to American companies. They've basically occupying West Europe, and they've come to an agreement with Stalin. Let's divide up let's say the spoils of World War II. Let's just sop up the rest of what remains of British-French imperialism. It would take a while in Southeast Asia and Africa, but eventually that would happen. And again, here's Yemen refusing to play along. And yes.
Hold on, Isa, because we're just about to get to the break, and I don't want to interrupt you while you're explaining this part of the story. So I think we'll just we'll kind of pause here for a moment, and we'll pick it up on the other end. But very fascinating stuff. I mean, I hope again the listeners are absorbing how much is really going on historically speaking in Yemen. I mean, we've only sort of scratched the surface of this as well. So again, I mean, I encourage people to go and get a copy of Isa's new book, Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. It's you can find it on Amazon as well as directly from it's a University of California press, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so we'll link up to both of those. But just truly fascinating. And again, quickly before we cut to the commercial break, I just wanted to illustrate again that this whole conversation about resources, which we will pick up later in the second hour, is almost completely erased from the current conversation when it comes to Yemen. So we should really kind of keep that in mind, because we never hear about oil or gas or gold or magnesium. There's a whole lot of other resources that are all in Yemen. We never hear about that in the conversation. But we will continue this in the second hour with Professor Isa Blumi of Stockholm University. So please do stay tuned.
Voice American.
It's practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Since the beginning, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, ancient Persia, Mongolia, Britain, and now America. Befallen by natural disasters, broken families, moral decay, lack of preparedness and conflict. Don't let this happen to you. Are you prepared? Would you like to help others prepare? AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com is looking for distributors. Email bugoutamerica@usa.com. Go to AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, a veteran-owned and operated company. But do it today.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me. American Freedom Radio, Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
And when we're not invading some sovereign nation or setting it on fire from the air, which is more fun for our Nintendo pilots, then we're usually declaring war on something here at home. Did you ever notice that about us? We love to declare war on things here in America. Anything we don't like about ourselves, we declare war on it. We don't do anything about it. We just declare war on it. It's the only metaphor we have in our public discourse for solving problems, declaring war. We have to declare war on everything. We have a war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on litter, the war on cancer, the war on drugs. But you ever notice we got no war on homelessness? Huh? No war on homelessness. You know why? There's no money in that problem. No money to be made off of the homeless. If you could find a solution to homelessness where the corporate swine and the politicians could steal a couple of $1 million each, you'd see the streets of America begin to clear up pretty quick. I'll guarantee you that. I will guarantee you that.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow, friendships to flourish, with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control out. Control is good. 5. Rocket copy. 3. 2. 1. Engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond. If you are joining us here in the second hour, we are speaking with Professor Isa Blumi, who is a senior lecturer and associate professor at Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies. He is the author of many books, including his latest book, which is out right now on the University of California Press. It is entitled Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. And we have been speaking about mainly right now the historical background behind the situation that we see ourselves in Yemen right now, but also just the historical background behind the whole region, talking about, Southern Arabia, the Red Sea, this whole region. And Isa, we were getting up towards the break in the last hour, but I want you to kind of continue where you were going in terms of Yemen right now. We were up to I guess about like the 30s, early 40s, and we've now seen the U.S. Beginning to kind of get a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula, mainly through the establishment of Aramco, which is a Saudi-American venture. And we, again, a theme that we will see time and time again, both in South and North Yemen, an independence, a desire to not be subjugated, which I would say is something that the British, the Americans, the Saudis, the Emiratis have really kind of never let go, and I think we'll see that a bit later as we move to more current historical events. But continue with where you were going towards the end there before I had to cut you off.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So we're now at the end of World War II. The Bretton Woods, commercial economic regime has been in place. The world's kind of assets have now been more or less divided between the two victorious great powers, nuclear powers, between the Soviet Union and the Americans. And one little pocket of resistance remains. And the attempt by traditionally how Americans would do it in Latin America or elsewhere would be either to corrupt pliable leaders who would then help facilitate the exploitation of natural resources or remove them and replace them with someone else. This was something the CIA was doing already in Syria in 1949. And obviously with Mossadegh in 1953, Iran also was disciplined in similar fashion. And there would be periodic attempts on other independents, so-called independent polities throughout the world. And Imam Yahya, who would pass in 1948 and had left with his son, Imam Ahmed, the responsibility of maintaining basically an independent North Yemen state, refusing to be sucked into the games of the Cold War, of globalization, and surrender North Yemen's, most importantly, dignity, as they framed it at least. That we would not be subdued and corrupted by materialism. It's literally the words they're using. And what's so fascinating is that in the American archives, you see already by the 1940s that some of these actors were trying to get through this Twitchell delegations in the 30s to get Yemen's clearly evident rich natural resources onto the side of them and signed up on American contracts, refusing to do that. They're trying again in the beginning and end of this early phase of the UN. North Yemen, very astutely, is sending one of the sons of the Imam to New York with a small delegation to negotiate access to the United Nations, to become a member of the UN. But what's so fascinating is that, again, despite the fact they're being treated in the literature as medieval, backward, isolated polity, that they're very attuned to how global politics is playing itself out. to the extent that they're one of the first, officially first states to condemn the creation of Israel. They are very vocal in this regard, and Palestine will remain until today. And indeed, you will see solidarity protests, despite the fact that this war has been going for 3 years. Upwards of 1 million people in protest in Sana'a over the events in Gaza, for instance, which again, it's quite remarkable, the affinity that Yemenis have for things that seem to be so far away and clearly no longer have any interest to most parts of the Middle East, at least.
Well, I was going to say Yemen is the only country that still seems to speak up against the brutality going on in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, I know. It's quite, and Syria, of course, but
yes,
we know what's happened. We know what happened to Syria, and of course Gaddafi's Libya, which we know what happened there too.
Yes, exactly.
So so they're negotiating. The son of Ahmed Imam Ahmed is negotiating for a seat in the UN, and the Americans at this time are trying to woo him. They have intelligence that suggests that he likes to drink wine. So they start to, as they again traditionally did with the Sauds and the others that they're trying to weed away from communism or from the British, bring them all the girls and all the wine that they may want. But the guy proves to be completely impervious to these very crude attempts to corrupt him. Then they start to proceed to take him to Washington and drive him specifically. And this is literally in the reports. They want to impress. They think it's this backward guy, right? Who's never seen running water, electricity or something, which is of course nonsense. So they're trying to impress him by driving along with a car along the newly created highways that the Americans are building left and right, right? And then they actually, it's not quite clear if they succeeded in getting him to go to Oklahoma, where they hunt. Well, not hunt, but oil companies that had long envisioned exploiting North Yemen's oil resources to come and meet with oil people there. And so there's clearly various ways of trying to seduce the son of the ruler of North Yemen to sign on a dotted line, basically sign away North Yemen's sovereignty in exchange for wine and girls, or in exchange for a percentage of this most likely very lucrative business in the future. The language is already in the 1940s. We can bring development to you. So they're already kind of flirting with this idea of this notion that modernization, which will become the kind of mantra of the 1950s with American imperialism in the third world, so-called third world, that we will develop, we will modernize, we will integrate your economy to the larger world, we'll bring you the kinds of things that you clearly admire of our civilization. And the problem for them is that the Imam's son was not admiring at all what he was seeing, right? And he had these rather scathing reports about what he was watching, what he was observing in American society and in the larger so-called developed world. And but he was very subtly, I mean, he's a young man, but amazingly, he's very subtly able to have this variety of interventions from American State Department and others, and said, look, I can't sign anything. This is not how things work in Yemen. We actually need to consult with each other. It has to be, an agreement between a larger committee. So kind of in it's cheeky kind of way of saying, there's a democracy back home, and I need to actually consult with others. So it's quite remarkable to read those documents, and then to think about the consequences, if you put in a larger context, that North Yemen would remain in an embarrassing kind of area of an area of frustration for American imperialism, as is playing out throughout the 1950s even. So by the 1950s, they've successfully got their seat in the UN. They've already made it quite clear that politically they're very progressive, if you want to use those terms. They're not hostile to the Soviet Union and then when Mao comes in the picture, they're even making agreements with Mao. They're making agreements with Sweden, which in those days was quite progressive and say socialist in orientation. They were making agreements with Tito in Yugoslavia, and as well agreeing to have some American contractors getting some business. So they're basically balancing everybody off very astutely, making it quite clear that we're willing to do business with you as long as you're willing to pay, charge us a fair price, and we're not going to surrender our sovereignty to you. And so in that way, throughout the 1950s, Imam Ahmed, again, this supposedly backward guy, basically got the infrastructure, which is today being destroyed over the last 3 years, purposely destroyed. The bridges, the canals, the ports, the roads, all those things that were being built in the Cold War and by this very sophisticated kind of use of Cold War tensions is now been targeted, ironically enough, by the very same interested parties who were hoping to seduce North Yemen into their orbit by building this stuff. So by the mid-1950s, you have another important series of events in the larger Middle East. You have the Free Officers Movement in Egypt, which overthrows the puppet regime of the British, and the arrival of what eventually will become Jamal Abdel Nasser, the kind of charismatic poster boy, if you will, for pan-Arabism, for Arab nationalism, for resistance against global capitalism in the Middle East. Taking the form of anti-Zionist politics, taking the form of making an alliance with everybody in the world. There's the whole notion of non-alignment or third way that Tito and Nehru and Sukarno and Nasser were pitching. In the middle of all this, obscured from the history books, but certainly you could find in all the documentation of this period by the Americans, British, and French, is Imam Ahmed. What's so interesting is that it's North Yemen who's advocating forging a military alliance. And ultimately they sign on the dotted line a military alliance in 1955 with Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And they're making overtures with Algeria slowly becoming, independent after this horrible war there. And more importantly, Imam Ahmed is allowing for the most radical of Palestinian actors like George Habash to come and settle in Taiz, the capital of North Yemen, and helps them and other activists from South Yemen actually start a process of throwing the British out, violently overthrowing the sultanates that are more or less propped up by the British support. So Imam Ahmed, the North Yemen, is a progressive, radical, we can't say socialist because the way the economy functioned, but it's part of the larger progressive world's struggle in the 1950s up until 1961 against global capitalism. And it's completely written out of the history books. And, it behooves people to revisit this period, because what you see today in North Yemen, when you have signs of people remembering those heroes fighting against globalization in the 1950s. I'm looking at a picture now of one of the leaders, the last basically independent leader of North Yemen, Ibrahim Hamdi. There's a picture with him with Che Guevara. So people are very attuned in North Yemen still to today about what their historic role was in the larger world. They were resisting globalization. They were resisting empire. And so for your audience to consider that, and one has to just very quickly look on the internet and look for pictures. There are pictures everywhere of the imams, Imam Ahmed and his sons, constantly in negotiation with Nasser. And Nasser and his contemporaries in Iraq and in Syria are all making overtures to North Yemen. So again, it's quite astonishing if one thinks back that North Yemen is considered to be completely out of this Cold War picture. In fact, it was at the very forefront, and in many ways it took the role of leadership in terms of military alliance, the discourse against Zionism, and the idea of forging a single united Arab republic. By 1961, unfortunately, they had already seen the writing on the wall. They saw that Egypt was representing actually very different kinds of interests. Nasser, as I demonstrated in my book, proved to be much more close to the Kennedy administration than has been previously recognized. The Egyptians became more or less dependent on the Americans for wheat assistance in return for kind of political compliance. So it became clear to North Yemen that they had lost their partnerships with the rest of the Arab world. And it's more or less at this time when Gamal Abdel Nasser and his henchman Anwar Sadat, who would eventually become leader of Egypt after Nasser's death in 1970. Anwar Sadat, by the way, very importantly, is married into North Yemeni politics, and his brother-in-law would become an important advocate for Egyptian invasion of North Yemen after the death of Imam Ahmed in 1962. So that's the beginning.
That's the North Yemen civil war, right?
What they call the civil war, yes. There was a war that basically half the political elite, if you will, stayed neutral for much of the war and would just periodically, to demonstrate their importance to either the British Saudis or to the Egyptians, would prove their utility by firing a gun in the air and getting some assistance. But what's important for this story is that North Yemen, there was a window of opportunity to enter into the fray in North Yemen and to permanently transform North Yemen's political horizons, if you will. And what's so interesting about how we interpret what was happening in the Civil War, if you want to call it that, from 1962 to 1970, where hundreds of thousands of Yemenis would die, it effectively stopped the incursions from North Yemen into South Yemen, even though Nasser paid lip service to fighting the British. And more importantly, there was an agreement from day one, both between the so-called adversaries in this Arab Cold War, with Malcolm Kerr, historian / political scientist, former head of AUB, and whose son is Steve Kerr, the coach of the Georgia, Golden State Warriors.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't realize that. That's an interesting connection.
Sadly, his father was assassinated as president of AUB, American University of Beirut, during the horrible events in Lebanon years ago. But his son, grew up and was born in Beirut. But anyway, so he commented that this was more or less akin to an internal war in the Middle East, a struggle over ideological ascendancy between the Saudi version of how the Islamic and Middle East should look and Nasser's one. And it's somewhat inaccurate, but we'll keep the metaphor as it is. But what's so fascinating about that is that despite the fact that Nasser and the Saudis were periodically at each other's throats, they both could agree at the beginning of the war and at the end of the war that the ruling family that had ruled one shape or form with these imams for over 1,000 years would not return. And despite the fact that the son of the deceased imam would continue to fight this so-called civil war for 8 years and ultimately flee in exile, and supposedly was being supported by another sympathetic monarchy in Saudi Arabia, that's really a bunch of nonsense. They were never going to allow the conditions at North Yemen before this war breaking out ever to be returned.
Well,
meaning,
no, go ahead, Isa. Go ahead.
Meaning that North Yemen would no longer be independent. North Yemen would no longer be able to say to both the British, the Americans, and the Saudis, or Egyptians in this case, no, we're going our own way. And so from that point on, excuse me, North Yemen became a much more, let's say, it was brought closer to the orbits of greater interested parties in the outside world. But it would remain resistant, and I'll explain in the next 20 or 30 minutes how that plays into the current events in North Yemen. So, sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, no, I was just going to say that, from the end of the what's called the North Yemen Civil War, in the late 60s, early 70s, I mean, we then see, in terms of like the modern history of Yemen, we see, as you said, this sort of like, just sort of like over and over again, these wars between what is North Yemen and what becomes the Marxist socialist state in southern Yemen. We see that in like 72 and 79, there's fighting. There's a civil war in southern Yemen in the late 80s. but it seems that, that becomes sort of the trend, as you said. I mean, to never allow either of them, but especially North Yemen, to never allow them to have any kind of independence. And it essentially becomes, at least the way I've interpreted it, is a succession of fights among regional and world imperial powers within the Middle East. So we have the Saudis are obviously involved. Jordan gets involved. The United Kingdom, the U.S., the Egyptians are involved, and it seems it just sort of goes back and forth until the 1990s when we have the unification. But I don't know if I want to jump that far ahead yet. I do want to ask you though, Isa. I mean, we've been focusing a bit on North Yemen right now. What is going on in southern Yemen? Because I mean, there's a whole there's an independent movement there as well, and it later becomes, as I said, a Marxist state that is aligned with the Soviet Union. There's a naval base there that the Soviet Union operates. And I guess maybe in the 70s and 80s, South Yemen becomes a bit of a player in terms of the independence movement, or as sort of like a bulwark against kind of like global imperialist capitalist system. So what's going on in southern Yemen briefly?
Right, very good. So recall that the British East India Company starts this system of signing treaties and creating and recognizing independent sultanates scattered territorially throughout what we call today South Yemen. And by 1960, when the British basically can't afford to sustain any presence east of Suez, Hong Kong, of course, is a huge prize. They'll continue to milk that for whatever it's worth. But elsewhere, after bloody wars in Malaysia and bloody wars in, India has already been released. They made a mess of South Asia by creating separate states, right? There's unified Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, and there's horrible wars of separation then. And with the exception of the Gulf states, because they know there's lots of oil there. I mean, this is where they can maintain some influence over their proxy, the Shah of Iran, who's actually the Pahlavi dynasty is allowed to become the big hegemon in the entire region, if you will. And in South Yemen, the problem with these sultanates is that, one, they're not very representative of the people, larger communities around them. Two, the British are constantly trying to draw as much rent from this loose alliance with so-called quasi-independent sultanates. So they control the ports. They control the revenue that comes through these ports, the use of these ports. And with just a couple of annual payments to these sultans, there's not much to go around for others. And because this part of the world has long been connected to global flows of trade, not only are the largely impoverished peasants constantly in frustrated relations with their sultans, so-called sultans, but you have these others coming from elsewhere who are undermining even their ability to pay for the rising cost of living in a cash-based economy that the British bring. And so what's so interesting is that the British long effectively using divide and rule tactics and pitting one group against the other, just like the Americans will do with Aramco up in Saudi Arabia and the oil industrial complex. They start to recruit outside laborers. And because they're so cheap and because they're stupid, they start to allow northern Yemenis to come down to work in the ports of South Yemen. And this, again, is under the pretext that, one, Yemenis are incapable of organizing, that they're anthropologists who are writing papers at Oxford or Cambridge saying that these are tribal peoples who are constantly at each other's throats. They'll never, forge a consolidated polity. They're backwards, so we can control them easily. And what they fail to appreciate is that this so-called medieval imam of the North is encouraging some of the most ardent Marxist ideologues in this early period of the Cold War to come and settle in Taiz. And working together with the imamate, they're infiltrating into South Yemen, where many of North Yemen's workers are now living and organizing labor unions. So you're seeing some of the most vibrant labor activism in this larger British commercial empire coming from South Yemen. And so by 1960, 61, 62, the British can't afford to maintain a police state. It can't afford to deal with the politics of working one sultan against the other. So they're basically saying, we're going to give you de facto independence, but it has to be under these various different sultanates. And it just increasingly proves to be problematic because every time the British send their very expensive garrisons home, right, composed of mercenaries from God knows how many countries. And recall that around this time, they're fighting all these nasty wars against independence movements in Africa. So there's so much blood on the hands of the British Empire at this stage. There's so much blood on the hand of these nasty types who help fight these counterinsurgencies around the world, that South Yemen becomes this one experimental zone for how do we manage these otherwise unmanageable insurgencies. And it just provides a window of opportunity for North Yemen and regional and even global anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist activists to get involved. So by the time 1967 comes along, Imam Ahmed is gone, the imamate is finished in North Yemen. Jamal Abdel Nasser and his allies are somewhat putting throwing some cold water on what could otherwise be a rapidly expanding, blazing fire of resistance in the larger Arabian Peninsula. 67 is basically the point where they can no longer sustain even a counterinsurgency between sultanates. So basically you have the creation, stemming and stopping the unification of North Yemen with South Yemen, allowing South Yemen to go independent. And it's taken over by these Marxists who have already global experience. Many of them traveled to Beijing or to Moscow, and they have very strong connections in the larger resistance against Zionism, against British and American imperialism. Certainly influence from what happened in North Africa and Algeria in particular. So you have now a core of hardened rebels and Marxist principles, a long history of union organization with strong North Yemeni contribution to all this. And it makes it always possible for North and South to unify. And so when the British leave and the Marxists kind of isolated state becomes an extension of the Soviet Navy in the Indian Ocean world, as you said. There's always the threat of South Yemen and North Yemen, if they could ever find a common ground to unify. And this is where then efforts to stop this very dangerous potential to ever happen, where they invest then more in northern Yemeni politics. And that's where it becomes interesting once again, because from 1967, when South Yemen becomes independent and becomes more or less a shining example, if you will, for the rest of the Arab world, for resistance, that you can actually gain independence and become still a principled Marxist state. There are in the regions in the Gulf, like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, that what we knew then as the trucial states, connected Qatar and Bahrain as well. They were all beginning to experience labor activism. Sometimes they would embrace Nasserism and non-alignment, but if you actually talk to people on the ground, they were actually looking at what's going on in South Yemen with considerable interest. Yemen did have an important imprint on the politics of the Gulf. And what's more important, after the fall of the last of the British sultanates, supported sultanates of South Yemen, the families dispersed, the ruling families of South Yemen dispersed, many ending up in exile in British-controlled trucial states. And their daughters started marrying into the ruling families of Abu Dhabi, of Ajman, of Ras Al Khaimah, of Dubai. And so within a couple of years, when UAE becomes independent in their own right, and distinctive from Qatar and Bahrain. The UAE becomes an extension of South Yemen politics and vice versa because of these marriage alliances. Now, it would take one generation to grow up as a result from these unions, right? These marriages between Yemeni women of prominent families from South Yemen and the ruling families of Abu Dhabi, etc. But by the 1980s, especially by the 1990s, the UAE's ruling elite would see South Yemen especially as a natural point of departure. They saw it as home, right? So this is very important to keep in mind. Now, as I mentioned, the desired direction for most Yemenis was unification. It made perfect sense. There's no reason why to separate these two entities that were in many ways figments of a period that they were hoping had ended with the creation of a Marxist South Yemen state. But with all the attention now on North Yemen, transforming the politics of North Yemen, as I mentioned in my chapter 4 of my book, it becomes really interesting because this is when really the Americans start to implement their strategies that they have used elsewhere in the world. And it's the politics of aid. I don't know if you recall from reading chapter 4, but I encourage the audience to either go to public library or get it by pirate if you want. I don't care. Just look at chapter 4 because it shows you what USAID, the Office of USAID, through the embassy in Taiz at this time, is going to try to do to force North Yemen into its orbit once again. You begin to see the investment in academics, writing reports for the USAID, writing reports for the Department of Agriculture. You see big conglomerates from agricultural development companies like Cargill and these types, sending their men and women down there to study the potential for exploiting North Yemen's rich lands. And this is when North Yemen, despite the fact that there's this Ibrahim al-Hamdi who has this brilliant system of redistributing the state's wealth and allowing for regional autonomy, allowing for farmers throughout the highlands of North Yemen to determine whether or not they want to grow products that are locally consumed or cash crops that are exported from the larger world. You see the Americans, this is their opportunity, window of opportunity. They get rid of this Ibrahim al-Hamdi. He's a very charismatic figure and a forgotten figure in Middle East history. Very sad because he was the last North Yemeni who demonstrated his long history of really resistance at the intellectual level as well as the economic, social, cultural ones. And so his assassination, probably hit by French mercenaries, and the ultimate replacement by Ali Abdullah Saleh, who would be hence the ruler from 1978 all the way until 2011, when his corrupt regime could no longer keep Yemen in control and was on the edge of being overthrown violently, and no one knew what would happen after that. This guy becomes the kind of key asset to making sure that the entire southern Arabian Peninsula would be somewhat subdued, that it would not go down its natural trajectory, which was unification and continued resistance against globalization. So what Ali Abdullah Saleh starts to do is cultivate and play off a number of, let's say, local political actors, prove himself to be astute enough to, at times, pose a threat to Saudi Arabia, thus gaining new kind of concessions from the Saudis' main protectors, the Americans, and when necessary, using this assets that could be gleaned from partnerships with Saudi Arabia, especially political Islam, especially Wahhabism, or this thing we call Takfirism, which is this nasty habit of Saudi and Qatari supported let's say, bellicose leaders to say anyone who doesn't follow the way we interpret Islam are kafir or pagans and must be attacked and killed. The violence from Saudi Arabia since the 70s especially has been directed at other Muslims, never against the outside world. And this is important to keep in mind as Ali Abdullah Saleh becomes the crucial intermediary between what is the potential disaster for Saudi Arabia, America, and global empire, which is an independent, powerful and very, very rich Yemen, which has a population of 25 million people, as was proved in South Yemen, an incredibly effective military that could basically, no great power would dare or deem it logical to try to invade South Yemen, right? And the fact that if these countries ever got together in a way that would actually pool all the resources from human to economic to natural, that this would be the superpower of the region, and potentially even one that would completely go off rail in terms of the larger global strategy, if you will. So Ali Abdullah Saleh plays this important role. He partners with important families like the Al-Ahmad family, who it may get too complicated to get into here, but you will occasionally hear the names of Al-Ahmad, even in contemporary politics today. You will hear references to the Wahhabi equivalents in Yemen today who are partnered with this Ahmad family. It's a political party called Islah Party. Its main spokesperson was granted the Nobel Peace Prize, the woman named Tawakkul Karman. You may have come across her.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton loved her, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
The Obama, yeah. And it's not a surprise because Qatar and the Clintons have very dubious relations for a long time now. But that's something that we need to step back from for a second, because it's from 1978 onwards, North Yemen will continue to be flirting with a variety of actions. So, as you noted yourself, there was a war between North and South Yemen in 1979, a very brief one, but it helped reestablish that there would be very different kinds of orientations in the larger world. And Ali Abdullah Saleh would occasionally flirt with political Islam. Ali Abdullah Saleh would occasionally flirt with being fully in line with the alliance against Zionism. So Saddam Hussein is Iraq, once he comes to power in 1978, becomes also a curious, occasional ally of North Yemen. And this is leading along until 1986. The larger context is very important because we have oil prices at an all-time low at $10 to $11 in 1986. And strangely enough, then Vice President of the United States, former head of the CIA, a oil man to the soul, deepest part of his soul, Bush Senior, goes to North Yemen and stands next to Ali Abdullah Saleh and signs on the dotted line a project that will to develop North Yemen's still meager, not yet recognized as large as what eventually will be recognized, oil and gas assets in 1978, upwards of $500 million project, which the Americans would not finance directly, but would actually get, and as we learned from very good reporting from LA Times only in 1991, that Saddam Hussein agreed to pay. And behind all this was Hunt Oil. The Hunt family is very close with the Bush family. And so the corruption of the carbon democracy that Timothy Mitchell refers to, or the oil industrial complex, is really playing itself in interesting ways in Yemen. In 1986, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be somehow funneled to Yemen to finance the construction of pipelines, of refineries, and drill sets for a commodity which is so cheap that no corporation would ever envision spending that kind of money for it. It would take decades or even longer to ever get a return on this investment. And yet, here is Bush Senior, Vice President of the United States, going to North Yemen and signing this agreement at this time. And what's so curious, and this is very important to understand South Yemen again, excuse me, in January of this same year, 1986, there was a violent uprising between rivals in South Yemen. Now, I'm not going to say without any equivocation that there was a CIA hand there, but it is very coincidental. It is an interesting coincidence that within a couple of months, Bush Sr. is going to North Yemen, signing an oil exploitation agreement, which will lead to hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in North Yemen's oil fields, which to a large extent actually is an extension of the largest parts of these fields that are in South Yemen. And so what's important, South Yemen, which again, after independence, did not have a recognized boundary with Saudi Arabia in this whole empty quarter. It is also there where everyone speculates is the biggest prize of all. It is also South Yemen's offshore oil that connects itself with this larger geological space that connects Somalia. And if you think what happened to Somalia since the 1990s, completely destroyed by a civil war between rival factions and basically ungoverned since, and all its offshore oil in Puntland in particular is being exploited today, it's not a coincidence. And within almost months of this agreement with Hunt Oil, thanks to George Bush's going down to North Yemen, North and South Yemen come to an agreement to start developing the mutually shared oil resources. And there's a whole territory which will be created, which will be basically an oil exploitation zone, despite the fact that in 1986 still, South Yemen is, in theory, a Marxist state. But the problem is the Soviet Union has basically abandoned patronizing. We're back in Yemen again.
Yes, we are, yeah.
So by 1986, we had this violent uprising in South Yemen. A new leader comes into power. Bidr, his name. Abid, sorry, I'm mixing up names. Abid, B-I-D. And he comes and signs his agreement with Ali Abdullah Saleh that we're going to slowly and incrementally conjoin our natural resource assets and start developing them. Now, why didn't persistently independent South Yemen just exploit its own resources? Again, they couldn't find anyone interested in developing their oil. It just cost too much. If oil's at $10, $11, there's no Brazilian company, there's no Soviet company that's going to throw in hundreds of millions of dollars to develop this. So this is the key. Who controls finance? Who can find cheap money to develop this infrastructure are going to be the big players in Yemen moving on forward. And this continues on to today. And we have to remember this because this will ultimately lead to the negotiations for unification. And by 1990, indeed, this vast territory is unified, linking North Yemen, as we saw with Ali Abdullah Saleh standing next to George Bush Sr., in the pocket, if not indirectly with the United States and Saudi Arabia, and South Yemen, which has much of the oil and gas and offshore assets that everyone's coveting. And so they basically effectively did, through Ali Abdullah Saleh, subdue for the next, let's say, 21 years, the potential of a unified Yemen becoming a regional superpower. Because Ali Abdullah Saleh, as I argued in a book that I wrote in 2010 called Chaos in Yemen, periodically would bring Yemen to the point of chaotic disaggregation. There would be a political kind of agenda of just bringing chaos to the political, let's say, backhanding. Help me out with this language. I'm losing my English now. The chessboard of domestic politics in Yemen was constantly upset by Ali Abdullah Saleh's purposeful use of chaos, use of violence, use of drones. Ali Abdullah Saleh, partnering with the Americans, were using Yemen to experiment on how these early stages of drone warfare could work. They start targeting potentially regional actors and identifying them as Islamic fundamentalists attached to Al-Qaeda, which of course was originally recruited by Osama bin Laden, who actually his family comes from Yemen.
Correct.
His father migrated to work in Saudi Arabia, and as did millions of Yemenis at some point in time. And this is an important thing to also remember as we move forward, that the millions of Yemenis who spent sometimes 20, 30 years working in the oil economies of Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia and UAE. In the case of Saudi Arabia, their children would go to Saudi schools and they would be indoctrinated in Wahhabism. And so when in 1990-91, when Yemen, out of an interesting calculation on Ali Abdullah Saleh's part, voiced solidarity for Saddam Hussein at the point of when there was this conflict over Kuwait. And Yemenis were punished by all the countries in the Gulf, with over 1 million of their workers being thrown back at this crucial moment of Yemeni unification. So Yemen suddenly became a huge, basically open, internally displaced refugee camp with over 1 million Yemenis who used to be breadwinners for their families, now thrown into a poor Yemen that had yet to fully develop its natural resources. And that's interesting and important because it's with these million plus Yemenis who come back after living a long time in Saudi Arabia that many of them actually have brought with them the Wahhabism. They become very cheap, easy assets for Saudi Arabia and Qatar to put and influence the politics of Yemen with this takfirism, this kind of violent, visceral, what for your audience may be more associated with Al Qaeda and then later on ISIS or the Islamic State. And this is a gift from Saudi Arabia for exploiting the fact that Yemenis for a long time had been the hard workers that were needed to build the roads, to maintain the hospitals, to even serve as the police and military force for much of the Gulf. And we forget that none of these societies have their own citizens serving in the military or the police. They could never allow fellow Saudis to have control over the police. So they would always outsource their police force. So today it's mostly Pakistanis or from Sudan or elsewhere. And in those days, Yemenis would also play an important part. So that not only did they get military training, so you have hundreds of thousands of Yemenis who are traditionally well armed, who also have some military training. They're impoverished by this kind of crude punishment of Yemen collectively in 1990-91. And it's more or less the same time we begin to see political Islam reign its ugly head there. Neighbors start pointing fingers at each other. Saudi-trained young men start saying, you Zaydi Shia, you Shafi Sunni, you are all enemies, all you Sufis, all you people who've been practicing Islam for 1,500 years, you don't know what you're practicing, and you are all kafir. To accuse a fellow Muslim of being non-Muslim is long considered very bad taste, but it's considered now politically expedient, and one should ask yourself why. So we're now in the 90s. We have this attempt at unification, but Ali Abdullah Saleh is keen on never allowing the South to have proper and let's say, influence over the day-to-day affairs of this now potentially very rich super state. He starts to initiate with these uprooted people deported from the rest of the Arabian Peninsula to send them throughout southern Yemen. So you begin to have a kind of a northern colonization, if you will, as Southerners would say. You begin to see the face of Aden, which during the period of the Marxist state, you had women going to school, wearing short skirts and wearing without veils and learning to speak many languages and very cosmopolitan. Aden suddenly becomes more or less looking like a Saudi city with all these Yemenis coming basically from the Gulf directly to help change the demographic balance, if you will, of the South. The key leaders of the military that had proven to be very, very successful fighters against British and then later on the Saudis in a brief war in 1991 over disputed territory, which I mentioned an hour ago. Those guys were removed. They lost their pensions. And you have this kind of quite obvious attempt to undermine not only the ability of southern Yemenis to become viable actors in a unified Yemen, but in some sad way, the viability of a unified Yemen ever to have stability. And it manifested ultimately in the civil war of 1994. I actually was in the country at the time when they were shooting Scud missiles at each other. It was a really nasty, very short war, which some would say that Saudis were actually encouraging the Southerners, ironically enough, to defect from this short-lived unified Yemen state. So it's in this period that the Americans, with their drones, start entering into the fray. Ali Abdullah Saleh and the Americans are using these drones to target political enemies. They're justifying it by saying they're fighting against Al-Qaeda. You see that increasingly Yemen is being integrated into global economy. More and more of its assets are being privatized. More and more of its offshore assets are being, let's say, at least marked off for exploration. Leases are being signed with oil companies in particular. Yemen has become so heavily dependent on food imports that this huge drain on the Yemen's national economy. Much of its savings is now effectively leaving the country. A perfect third world kind of state it has turned out to be, more or less suiting and satisfying the demands of American empire. So under Ali Abdullah Saleh, over the course of some 30 years, this country's seen several wars. It's seen much of its breadwinners who worked overseas being returned without compensation. Its economy has been purposely integrated in these exploitative mechanisms of global capitalism. And so by 2011, enough was enough. But what's important in this enough is enough period is that in a specific area in the northwest of the country, along this occupied territory of Asir, in which the Saudis in 1934, if you recall, captured, by 2000, in the most provocative way, the Americans and Saudi Arabia demanded of Ali Abdullah Saleh to sign a treaty which would permanently sign off and agree upon a boundary that would extend the entire extent of unified Yemen. And what that did...
Lisa, let me interrupt you here because we've only got about 2 minutes left.
Oh, no.
But I think this is a good place to pause because we've now moved the entire history and narrative up to 2011, more or less, which would be and this is the beginning of the ultimate destruction and genocide that we're seeing in Yemen right now. So why don't we kind of pause here and, if you have a little bit of time, we can continue this conversation right now, or we can basically we could just do a whole other episode talking about from the mid to late 2000s up until where we are right now. But I just wanted to also please do tell the listeners where they can go to follow your work, if you're on Twitter, anything like that, and where they can go to buy your new book, which is Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. So please let everybody know, Isa.
Yes, you may follow me on Twitter. It's easy enough, Isa Blumi. You may look me up in Google Scholar. Much of my work is available on PDF version or academia.edu. I have several publications related to Yemen, which you could find in any, let's say, retail provider seller of books. I'm not going to suggest anyone in particular. Better yet, encourage your public library to pick up a copy, and then you can basically, with the rest of your community, share the pleasures of reading my prose, which I'm sure you're all now falling asleep listening to me for the last 2 hours. Yeah.
Oh no, I know everyone is on the edge of their seat. Believe me.
Okay. And I do hope that not only can you draw from what I am tweeting or retweeting in my Twitter, but you actually then spend a little bit more time researching and exploring yourself, because it does require far more time than any podcast or any recorded interview could provide, or indeed a whole semester of coursework. So unless you join me in Stockholm, sit in one of my classes, the best thing for you is to pursue this on your own, and allowing my book and my tweets, I think is what you call it, to help at least give you a starting chance to get access to what the real story is, I would suggest.
Absolutely, and I think that this first of what I hope will be a continuing conversation with you on the show will be a wonderful place for people to kind of start. But again, definitely pick up a copy of the book. Isa Blumi, thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully we'll be talking very soon.
I hope so too. Thank you very much for having me.
No rules, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, We are American Freedom Radio.
Since the beginning, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, ancient Persia, Mongolia, Britain, and now America. Befallen by natural disasters, broken families, moral decay, lack of preparedness and conflict. Don't let this happen to you. Are you prepared? Would you like to help others prepare? AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com is looking for distributors. Email bugoutamerica@usa.com. Go to AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, a veteran-owned and operated company. But do it today.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me. American Freedom Radio, Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
And when we're not invading some sovereign nation or setting it on fire from the air, which is more fun for our Nintendo pilots, then we're usually declaring war on something here at home. Did you ever notice that about us? We love to declare war on things here in America. Anything we don't like about ourselves, we declare war on it. We don't do anything about it. We just declare war on it. It's the only metaphor we have in our public discourse for solving problems, declaring war. We have to declare war on everything. We have a war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on litter, the war on cancer, the war on drugs. But you ever notice we got no war on homelessness? Huh? No war on homelessness. You know why? There's no money in that problem. No money to be made off of the homeless. If you could find a solution to homelessness where the corporate swine and the politicians could steal a couple of $1 million each, you'd see the streets of America begin to clear up pretty quick. I'll guarantee you that. I will guarantee you that.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach approach phase. Everything looking good. Good control is good. 5. Roger, copy. 3, 2, 1. Engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio.